Under the warm yellow lights of the Halberd Public Library, the building exhaled its usual end-of-day stillness. It was just after 6:45 p.m. on a Friday night. Quiet, uneventful, the way Carol Finch liked it. She'd worked here for over 20 years, tucked into the rhythm of shelving, scanning, and sorting, her fingers intimately familiar with the Dewey Decimal System and the creak of every floorboard. At 52, Carol was the kind of woman people noticed only when she wasn't there. Unassuming, reliable, someone who moved through life with a sort of disciplined calm. Her last shift was supposed to be just like any other. Instead, it became the last confirmed moment anyone ever saw her. The last known footage shows her entering the basement-level bookroom at precisely 7:15 p.m. Security logs confirmed the timestamp, and the grainy black-and-white camera feed, installed more for insurance than actual monitoring, shows her holding a small cart of books. She stops for a second, keys in a code, and disappears through the door. She doesn't look alarmed. She doesn't seem followed. Nothing about her posture indicates anything out of the ordinary. And yet, Carol Finch never came back through that door, and no camera ever captured her leaving the building. When her co-worker, Maggie Reyes, returned downstairs at 7:40 p.m. to grab her purse, Carol's cart was there, half-shelved. Her reading glasses were still resting on the reference desk. Her cardigan, the one she always wore on late shifts, hung neatly over her chair. At first, Maggie assumed Carol had stepped into the staff restroom or gone to the upper floor. But 10 minutes passed, then 15. The lights were still on in the bookroom, but it was empty. Maggie checked the restroom. Nothing. Upstairs. Nothing. The building was completely silent. By 8 p.m., with closing procedures finished and Carol still nowhere in sight, Maggie called the library's head administrator. Then, the police. Officers arrived shortly after and began a standard sweep of the premises. At first, they treated it like a lock-in. Maybe Carol had stepped into one of the back rooms, got turned around in the maze of old storage, or simply fallen asleep behind a stack. But nothing turned up. They scoured the entire building, every locked room, every stairwell, every closet. And still, nothing. The library had only one entrance and one staff-coded emergency exit. The front door had no recent entries or exits after 7:15 p.m., and the back door showed no sign of use. No alarm trip, no forced entry, no logs. The bookroom itself was unsettling in its stillness. Carol's work cart remained in the aisle beside the rare donation shelf, which she'd been cataloging that night. First editions, memoirs, fragile journals donated by local families. Her notes sat on the edge of the table, the pen still uncapped beside them. There was no sign of a struggle. No knocked-over items, no stains, no odd smells, just a silence that began to take on a strange weight as the hours passed. By midnight, a full search of the property had begun. The building was small, only 3 floors including the basement, but the oldest parts, the archives and sub-basement crawl spaces, were confusingly laid out. Local police requested assistance from the fire department to search behind locked storage doors, ventilation access points, and anywhere someone might have accidentally become trapped. They found dust, spiderwebs, forgotten crates of outdated reference books, but no Carol. Her car was still parked out back, locked, keys still in her purse in the staff lounge. Her phone sat face down in her desk drawer, battery low. Security footage was pulled from every angle in the building. Only one camera, the one facing the hallway outside the bookroom, showed anything of use. It captured Carol entering. No one followed. No one left. Every other angle of the library remained quiet and unoccupied for the remainder of the evening. The following morning, the library remained closed to the public. Investigators expanded the search perimeter, interviewing employees, checking neighboring buildings, even canvassing the neighborhood in case Carol had somehow wandered out in a disoriented state. But the town of Halberd was small, and the hours between her disappearance and sunrise had yielded no sightings, no calls, no signs of movement. Carol Finch had vanished into a locked room, in a locked building, without a single footprint left behind. By Monday, missing person flyers had already started appearing on bulletin boards across town. Locals were shocked. Carol wasn't the type to disappear. She had a routine, a daughter she spoke to nearly every day, a cat she never forgot to feed, a grocery list always pinned to her fridge. There were no debts, no mental health red flags, no reason to run. She didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't leave things to chance. She was the last person anyone would expect to vanish. But in a town as small as Halberd, word travels fast, and suspicion travels faster. People began to ask, was someone hiding in the library that night? Could the building have been breached somehow? Was Carol hiding something of her own? Or was there something inside that book room that no one had seen yet? 8 years would pass before anyone would know just how strange that answer might turn out to be. The search began before sunrise. Officers had stayed on site overnight, cataloging every square foot of the Halberd Public Library. But when the morning shift of firefighters arrived, the tone shifted from cautious to urgent. By then, the reality had sunk in. Carol Finch hadn't simply wandered off or fallen asleep behind a shelf. Something had happened inside that building, something that made no sense, and the deeper they looked, the more it felt like they were chasing shadows in a place that shouldn't have any. Firefighters worked with schematics of the building, old ones outdated by decades. The library had been renovated multiple times since the early 70s, and the basement had once served as a civil records archive before being converted to storage. Over the years, walls had been added, doors sealed, entire crawl spaces forgotten behind layers of drywall and shelving. The book room where Carol was last seen had only one door, a fire-rated steel slab requiring a security code. That door was logged as opened only once that night, when Carol entered. No other badge scans, no emergency override, just one quiet entry and no exit. By noon, firefighters were tracing air vents, checking ductwork, testing structural seams behind shelving units. In one corner of the room, they found a section of the wall that gave slightly when pressed. It wasn't a door, not in any traditional sense, but it was clear something had been sealed there. Plaster over old hinges, mismatched brickwork, a faint outline barely visible in the paint. It aligned with a crawl space noted in the 1958 building plans, but absent in modern ones. With approval, they drilled into the wall. Behind it was a narrow cavity, just under 3 feet tall and running about 10 feet deep. Dust coated every surface. Cobwebs stretched between beams. A cracked crate of water-damaged documents sat untouched, their pages fused together. But nothing else. No sign of Carol, no fibers, no blood, no items left behind. The cavity had likely been sealed decades ago, but that didn't explain why it showed signs of recent settling, as if something had shifted behind it. Investigators then focused on other structural anomalies. Every door and window was logged or secured. The emergency exit remained armed, no alerts, no breach. The surveillance footage had already been reviewed frame by frame. Aside from Carol's final walk into the book room, the rest of the library remained still. Not a single unexplained figure, no movement in the upper floors, just the quiet monotony of fluorescent lights humming over empty stacks. Interviews with staff yielded little. Carol's co-workers described her as warm, reliable, consistent to a fault. But one detail stood out. Maggie Reyes, who had worked the evening shift with Carol, hesitated before mentioning it. She said Carol had seemed distracted lately. Not forgetful, just preoccupied. Some days she lingered too long in the basement. Other times, she didn't respond when spoken to. 2 weeks earlier, Carol had arrived an hour early, unannounced, and spent most of that time rechecking donation inventory. When asked why, she brushed it off. That wasn't like her. Carol kept routines. She wasn't prone to whims or obsessions, but Maggie hadn't thought much of it until now. Looking back, she recalled seeing Carol sitting in the closed stacks with a few old books spread out, unusual volumes that hadn't been cataloged in years, handwritten labels, some in languages Maggie couldn't identify. Carol hadn't shared what she was doing, and Maggie hadn't asked. Now, that silence felt like a missed opportunity. Police began to expand the scope of their questions. Had anyone unusual come into the library recently? Had any rare books gone missing? Were there gaps in the library's donation records? But the answers kept circling back to the same frustrating truth. Nothing obvious had changed. No break-ins, no suspicious visitors, no threats. It was as if Carol had simply ceased to exist the moment she stepped through that door. They brought in cadaver dogs, scanned the entire building with ground-penetrating radar, reviewed Carol's library logs, emails, employee messages, all normal, no flagged activity. Her last recorded task was logging 3 rare titles into the system. Books donated by a now-deceased estate, boxed and left untouched for over a year. The titles were obscure, barely searchable online, and appeared to be memoirs or field notes from the early 20th century. The books themselves, still sitting on the donation shelf, right where she left them. By the 3rd day, the search team began to scale back. There were no new leads, no further footage to review, and no practical explanation. The case was labeled as a missing person under suspicious circumstances. The library was temporarily closed, but the whispers around town had already started. Some said she had a breakdown and left. Others speculated someone had hidden inside, evading detection. A few believed she had found something she wasn't supposed to. But no one could agree on how a woman vanished inside a sealed room with no exits. As the official search efforts slowed, Carol's daughter, Rachel, arrived in Halberd, demanding answers. She didn't believe her mother would just leave, and if no one else was going to figure out what happened in that sealed room, she was prepared to start digging herself. Because something had shifted in Carol's life, something no one saw in time. And whatever it was, it started long before she walked into that room. At first glance, Carol Finch's house didn't look like the kind of place that held secrets. Everything was neat, orderly, and quietly lived in. A kettle still rested on the stove. Her calendar was turned to the week she vanished. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows, nothing out of place. Until investigators opened her study. That's when the questions multiplied. The room was small, tucked behind the kitchen, filled with old hardcover books, paper files, and framed photos. Her daughter Rachel stood quietly as officers cataloged everything. There were no computers. Carol preferred writing by hand. Dozens of spiral-bound notebooks lined the lower shelves, most filled with book summaries, reference notes, and checklists. But then came the fireplace. Inside it, they found the remains of a journal, burnt just enough to destroy part of it, but not all. A few pages remained intact, warped by heat but legible. Scrawled in Carol's handwriting were names, dates, and strange notations, sequences of numbers, letters grouped in repeating clusters. It wasn't random. It was a pattern. Rachel's voice cracked as she explained. In the months leading up to her mother's disappearance, Carol had become consumed by something she found in the basement of the library. She never called it a project. She called it a puzzle. It had started with a donation, boxes of books delivered posthumously from the estate of a retired professor who'd lived in Halberd during the 1940s. Most of the books were unremarkable, but some had handwritten inserts, notes, annotations, and what appeared to be original manuscripts. Carol hadn't spoken much about them, only saying they were unofficial histories. But Rachel remembered something else. A conversation weeks before Carol vanished in which she said she'd found references to a private archive that wasn't listed in the library system. Something buried in the older stacks, something tied to Halberd itself. Among Carol's personal belongings was a folder of clipped newspaper articles, some yellowed with age. Most were local stories, fires, disappearances, strange reports from the early 1900s to the 1950s. One in particular was circled in red, a 1939 article about a reclusive man named Miles Edward Shaw, a linguist and historian who had lived on the outskirts of Halberd. According to the article, Shaw donated his private collection to the library before his death, but the donation was never fully cataloged. The article ended with a quote, "What is buried must stay buried for the benefit of the town." Carol had underlined that sentence 3 times. When investigators returned to the library to re-examine the pre-WYC donation boxes, they found something they hadn't noticed the first time. Tucked between 2 water-damaged volumes was a smaller notebook, leather-bound, faded, and brittle at the edges. It was written in Carol's handwriting, but unlike anything they'd seen before. Each page was filled with grids, numbers, and symbol clusters. Some passages were in plain English, describing her attempts to decode symbols from Shaw's manuscripts. But as the entries went on, they grew more erratic. The dates don't make sense. This name keeps appearing. Was this intentional? The final entry was unfinished. He saw me reading it. A handwriting analyst confirmed the notebook was written over several months. There were clear signs of stress, words pressed harder into the paper, irregular spacing. It was as if Carol was rushing toward something, but wasn't sure what she'd find. The codes she was trying to break weren't just literary games. They appeared to be based on cipher techniques used in the 1930s and 40s, possibly tied to wartime correspondence. But who she was writing for, or to, was never clear. The most unsettling part came when Rachel pointed out something the investigators hadn't noticed. Carol had written the Yaoya, same symbol, 3 vertical lines crossed by a horizontal slash, over a dozen times throughout the journal. It appeared in margins, in empty spaces, sometimes even replacing punctuation. When asked, Rachel said she didn't know what it meant, but she remembered her mother drawing it once, absent-mindedly, while they had coffee. Carol had said it reminded her of something she saw carved into one of the basement walls at the library. Investigators followed up on that detail, bringing in specialists to examine the structural foundation of the library. Behind a removable panel near the old records room, they found it, the same symbol etched faintly into the brick. Beneath it, another set of markings, long faded. A contractor estimated the carving had to be at least 60 years old. Rachel began pushing harder for answers. She filed a request for the full donation inventory from the Shaw estate, but the original list was incomplete. Several books mentioned in the article didn't match any currently in storage. It was clear something had been moved or taken, but by who and why? Police couldn't determine whether Carol had uncovered something of historical significance, or if she'd simply gone too deep into a mystery with no real foundation. But Rachel was convinced this wasn't paranoia or obsession. She believed her mother had found something someone didn't want her to, whether it was buried knowledge, forgotten records, or something else entirely. It all led back to that notebook, the one written in code, the one they still couldn't crack. And that was the problem. Carol Finch had left behind a trail, but it wasn't pointing in a single direction. It was a spiral, and at the center of it was a story no one yet understood. The tip came unexpectedly, nearly 3 weeks after Carol Finch vanished. It didn't come from law enforcement or a forensic lab, but from a man most people in Halberd barely noticed. His name was Henry Knox, though most of the locals just called him Hank. He'd been homeless for years, drifting between alleyways, shelters, and park benches. But he remembered faces, watched patterns, and noticed things that others missed. And on the night Carol disappeared, Hank claimed he saw someone leaving the rear side of the Halberd Public Library. A man in a blue overcoat, carrying a leather satchel, moving quickly, purposefully, and then gone. The claim immediately raised eyebrows. The rear side door of the library hadn't been functional for over a decade. According to maintenance records, the locking mechanism had been sealed during renovations, and the door was now bolted shut from the inside. But Hank insisted. He said he was across the street behind the diner, where he sometimes scavenged leftover food late at night. From there, he had a clear line of sight to the side alley that ran behind the library. He was adamant. He saw the man step out around 7:30, just minutes after Carol was last seen, entering the book room. He said the man didn't look scared or rushed, just like someone who knew exactly where he was going. At first, police took the statement, but quietly dismissed it. They cited Hank's inconsistent mental health history, lack of physical evidence, and the locked nature of the door he described. They ran a cursory check of the alley and found nothing. No footprints, no fingerprints, no security footage. But Rachel didn't dismiss it, not even close. She met with Hank herself, brought him coffee, listened patiently, and asked detailed questions. He repeated the story each time with striking consistency. The coat was dark blue, long, down to the man's knees. The satchel was worn leather, old, like something from another era. The man didn't look young, but not elderly either. Mid-50s maybe. No glasses, no facial hair. And something else. He walked with a slight limp. Rachel took notes, and then she began building a timeline. Using everything she'd gathered, Carol's last known activities, her decoded journal entries, the surveillance logs, and now this new sighting, Rachel created a detailed chart that spanned months, not days. She wasn't trying to prove her mother had vanished. She was trying to prove someone else had been planning it. She started with the donation records. The pre-World War II collection Carol had been so focused on had been signed over by the estate of a doctor, Evelyn Shaw, the niece of the original donor, Miles Edward Shaw. Rachel dug into the family's history and found that Miles Shaw had published exactly one known paper during his lifetime, a piece on cryptography linguistics, dismissed by peers as academic gibberish. He was said to be eccentric, secretive, and borderline paranoid. His home had been boarded up for years before being torn down in the 1980s. But when Rachel requested public records from the town archives, she found something strange. Miles Shaw had applied for a secondary permit in 1943 for a private reading annex to be installed beneath his home. The contractor listed a man named Franklin Harrow. Nowhere in the public registry did Harrow appear again. No business license, no address, just a single contract for a job that was completed and signed. Rachel tracked the name through ancestry databases, census records, anything she could find. Nothing matched, but the surname appeared once more. In the ledger of donated books, a handwritten note in the margin of one journal read, "Given by Harrow, return to closed shelf." The same shelf Carol had been cataloging the night she disappeared. Rachel took her findings to the police. Again, they listened, but politely declined to reopen the case based on speculation. They had no body, no confirmed crime, and now a witness who'd vanished. Because just days after Hank gave his statement to Rachel, he disappeared. His usual bench in the park remained empty. His name wasn't logged at the shelter. No one had seen him. It wasn't like him. He might have been unpredictable, but he didn't just leave town. Rachel filed a missing persons report. Nothing came of it. She requested another inspection of the side door. A structural engineer confirmed that, yes, the door had been sealed, but the locking bolts on the inside had been loosened, likely within the past year. Not broken, not tampered, but unscrewed and replaced so gently the damage was invisible unless closely inspected. Someone with keys, someone with access, someone who knew how to leave unnoticed. Rachel stood in that alley more than once after that, trying to picture it. A man in a blue coat walking quietly into the night, a satchel in hand. Was he watching Carol? Was he the one leaving the notes? Was he a descendant of someone involved in the coded journals? Or was he something worse, someone who had been waiting for the right person to find what was never meant to be found? And if that was true, then maybe it wasn't about Carol at all. Maybe it was about what she read, or what she planned to tell someone. Rachel didn't have all the pieces yet, but she wasn't done. Not even close. Because if someone could leave through a door that no longer existed, then maybe what everyone thought was impossible had always been planned. The closed stacks had always been the forgotten heart of the Halberd Public Library. Locked behind a narrow door in the basement, the space wasn't open to the public. Most people in town didn't even know it existed. The collection down there had grown over decades, filled with odd donations, inherited estates, and long-forgotten literary fragments. There was no digital record of what the room actually held, just shelf after shelf of uncatalogued books, some brittle with age, others wrapped in twine, still unopened. The room smelled like mildew and ink, a place more archival than alive. When detectives returned to the library for a deeper search, the closed stacks became the focus. Carol Finch had spent hours in that room in the weeks before she disappeared. A volunteer named Max, a local college student who helped reshelve donations, told investigators that Carol often stayed after her shift to work in there alone. She never asked for help, never explained what she was looking for. She'd sit on a stool with a stack of books beside her, flipping through them one by one, taking notes in a small leather-bound journal she always carried, one that was never recovered. The room itself was cluttered and poorly lit. Dozens of titles bore no markings on the spine, and several had loose index cards tucked into their jackets. One by one, investigators removed the books and tagged their locations. That's when they found something unusual. A series of index cards, all dated in the same narrow window, between June and September of that year. Each card contained handwritten notes, initials, or catalog numbers that didn't correspond with anything in the library system. One card had Carol's full name in cursive, followed by a short phrase. See ledger number 14, Shaw. The handwriting on that card was confirmed to be Carol's, but when investigators dusted it for prints, they found something else, a second set, partial but clean. It didn't belong to any library employee, volunteer, or known visitor. When run through national databases, it came up as no match. The print was from someone who had never been arrested, fingerprinted, or documented. Someone unknown. That discovery reframed the investigation. It meant Carol hadn't been down there alone, or at the very least, someone else had handled the same material she had. Officers pulled the old building permits again. It turned out the closed stacks had been added during the 1952 expansion, after a flood damaged much of the original records room. The donation logs from that period were incomplete. What had started as a side room for overflow materials had evolved into an informal holding space for unusual collections, items deemed too delicate, obscure, or confusing to process. Most were passed down by private collectors, professors, or relatives of the town's founding families. No one had audited the room in years. Rachel returned to the space herself, cataloging each book her mother had left notes on. One, a faded red volume with a torn cover, had a library card that read, "Do not shelve, belongs to S." The card had been written in pencil, then erased, then written over again. Inside the book were 3 dried petals pressed between pages, Iris, Carnation, and Black-Eyed Susan. A folded slip of paper was glued to the back cover. It read, "Transcript of tape number." 3, burial confirmed. There was no tape, no further explanation, but the word burial sent a jolt through Rachel. She asked police to test the paper. It came back consistent with mid-century stock, at least 60 years old. In another volume, an account book from the 1930s, someone had scribbled in the margins, "Use alternate name, F. Harrow." That name had surfaced before. Franklin Harrow, the man suspected of constructing the hidden annex under Miles Shaw's home. But there was no record of Franklin Harrow ever having donated a single item to the library. He wasn't listed in the phone book, the tax rolls, or the town cemetery. The more Rachel looked, the more the name seemed to appear only around objects that led nowhere. She began mapping the connections. Certain books in the closed stacks shared themes, private correspondences, family secrets, mentions of a reading society that required coded invitations. She wondered whether her mother had stumbled onto something more than an academic curiosity. The notes didn't read like research. They read like warnings. And still, the unknown fingerprint remained a constant echo. It wasn't just that someone had handled the same book. It was the timing, the placement, the fact that it was on the same card Carol had written on, meaning they had likely touched the same item within days of each other. That person, whoever they were, had been in the stacks, perhaps more than once, and they'd left without being seen. Rachel asked herself the question that had begun to haunt her. Was her mother being watched? Did someone know what she was uncovering? And if so, was she silenced before she could tell anyone? She didn't have those answers. But what she did have was a growing pile of evidence that pointed to something hidden beneath the surface of the library's history, something not just stored away but deliberately obscured. Someone had been in the closed stacks besides Carol, and whatever they were after, they'd left just enough behind to make sure she followed. The house sat just beyond the edge of Halbert's town limits, where the pavement turned to gravel and the trees pressed in close. The structure itself had almost disappeared under vines and ivy, half swallowed by time and weather. Most people in town referred to it as the Shaw place, though no one seemed to know who Shaw actually was. To most, it was just another abandoned relic from another forgotten era. But to Rachel Finch, it was the one location her mother had circled twice in her notes and then underlined. It was listed in the public record as condemned, boarded up in 1979. But when Rachel arrived, the front door wasn't locked. It was warped and soft from rot, but it opened with a hard push. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and mildew. The wooden floor groaned beneath every step. Most of the house had collapsed in on itself. The kitchen was nearly unrecognizable, the staircase hanging half detached. But in the far back, behind a door that stuck hard to its frame, one room was intact, and it was unlike anything Rachel had expected. The walls were lined with identical leather-bound books, journal after journal, all completely uniform. No titles, no spine labels, no signs of use. She picked one up. Blank, another. Still blank. She checked a third. Nothing. Page after page of clean parchment. It didn't make sense. There were hundreds of them, all pristine, untouched. But then she noticed one book tucked low behind a panel of molding, wrapped in wax paper. The leather was older, cracked, and slightly darker than the others. Inside, in faded ink, one line had been handwritten on the first page. M.E.S., 1941. It was the initials she recognized from her mother's notes. Miles Edward Shaw, the recluse who had donated the mysterious collection to the Halberd Library. Carol had been convinced he was the key to whatever she had uncovered. Rachel turned the pages slowly. Most were filled with fragments, names, scattered lines, and buried between it all was a reference to someone named Clara. One sentence stood out. Clara knows. If they find the collection, they'll bury it again. Halberd must not remember. It was dated October 3rd, 1941. Exactly. 81 years before Carol vanished. Rachel scanned the room again. Beneath the cracked floorboard near the far wall, she found a shallow compartment lined with rusted tin. Inside were 6 envelopes, still sealed with wax, and an old rusted key. Each envelope was addressed in the same hand, to Clara. The letters were never sent. Rachel carefully opened one. The ink had bled slightly, but it was readable. Shaw wrote about being followed, receiving anonymous threats, and a growing fear that what he had discovered was not only controversial, but dangerous. In another letter, he referenced a private archive stored beneath his home. He claimed it contained records, photographs, and evidence of a group he called the Reading Circle. It wasn't a book club, he said. It was something older, something meant to control information, especially within the town. Police confirmed the house belonged to Miles Shaw, but claimed nothing connected it to Carol's disappearance. They ran forensics on the letters in the journal. No prints besides Rachel's. No trace evidence that could link the home directly to Carol. But the floor compartment showed signs of being disturbed recently. Scratches, fingerprints smudged. Someone else had opened it before Rachel. That person had taken something. Back at the library, Rachel cross-referenced every name in the letters with the old donation logs. 3 of the names had been scratched out on the original donor list. Those entries were the same volumes Carol had pulled during the week she vanished. One journal had a card that read, "Do not shelve, belongs to S." Inside the cover, another phrase had been handwritten, transcript of tape number 3. Burial confirmed. No tape was ever found. The book's last page had been torn out. Rachel brought her findings to the investigators, but the case remained stalled. No new leads, no confirmed suspects, and still no sign of Carol. They told her there wasn't enough to reopen the file. The materials weren't proof of a crime, just strange history. But Rachel wasn't convinced. Someone had erased the past. Someone had gone to great lengths to remove every trace of what Shaw was trying to preserve. Her mother hadn't disappeared by accident. She had stepped into something that had already tried, once before, to vanish into silence. Rachel stood in the center of that ruined room, holding the signed journal in her hands. It was the last thing Shaw had written before he disappeared. It was also the last thing her mother had underlined in her notes. The words echoed now, in a different way. Halberd must not remember. But someone had remembered. Carol Finch. And she'd gotten too close to the truth. and whatever had been hidden once had been hidden again. Only this time, whoever buried it made sure not to leave the body behind. It had been 5 months since Carol Finch disappeared, and the official search had gone quiet. The library had reopened with limited hours. Investigators had moved on to other cases, but Rachel hadn't stopped. She returned to the building at night, studying her mother's notes, retracing every step. The staff tolerated her presence. They knew who she was and what she was looking for. Sometimes they offered to help, but there wasn't much more to say. The place had already been searched, or at least that's what everyone thought. It wasn't until Rachel came across the original blueprints that something shifted. A retired town clerk had offered her access to the city archives, where she located the 1952 plans for the Halberd Public Library. Buried in the documents was a detail that had been overlooked during every previous inspection: a freight dumbwaiter system installed decades earlier to transport books from the basement to the main floor. It had been decommissioned during the renovation in the 1970s and was believed to have been sealed off entirely. The current floor plan made no mention of it, but the blueprint showed the shaft's location directly behind the shelving unit where Carol had last been seen. Rachel brought the blueprints to the investigators. Reluctantly, they agreed to another inspection. Maintenance workers removed the shelving section inch by inch until they exposed a steel panel embedded in the wall. Welded seams ran down the edges, rusted and discolored. It looked solid, immovable. But after several hours of cutting and grinding, the panel finally gave way. Behind it was a narrow vertical shaft, about the width of a closet. Dust clouded the air. The metal walls were streaked with condensation. It smelled like time itself had pooled there and never left. A forensics team was called in. They lowered a remote camera snake into the shaft. The feed flickered at first, the signal distorted by the reinforced concrete. Then the image came into focus, dim, claustrophobic, but clear. The shaft was empty. No body, no fabric, no hair, just silence. Until the camera caught on something wedged near the bottom, a small object lying against the corner. When the robotic arm retrieved it, everyone in the room went still. It was a wristwatch, cracked glass, leather band, warped from moisture, and engraved on the back were 3 small letters: to CF. It didn't take long to confirm it was Carol's, a gift from her late husband engraved for her 40th birthday. Rachel recognized it immediately. Her mother wore it every day, always on her left wrist, always. It had never been listed among her missing personal items, leading investigators to believe she had been wearing it the night she vanished. Now, here it was, at the bottom of a shaft no one had known existed until now. The implications were immediate and troubling. If Carol had fallen or been placed into that shaft, how did it happen without anyone hearing? The shaft had been welded shut for decades. There was no external access. The elevator mechanism itself had been removed during renovations. The only way in was from the basement, and even that entry had been hidden behind fixed shelving for years. The possibility that someone else had known about it, reopened it, used it, was difficult to ignore. But if she had been placed there, why was there no body, no signs of struggle, no biological evidence? The watch showed signs of impact damage, but no blood, no hair caught in the band. Just that single object in a void of silence. Investigators scanned the entire shaft again: thermal imaging, ground-penetrating radar, air quality tests. Nothing. It was as if the watch had been dropped deliberately, as if someone wanted it to be found, eventually. Theories began to circulate again. Some believed Carol had discovered the shaft during her research, tried to investigate it herself, and fallen. Others were convinced someone else had used it, someone with knowledge of the library's original architecture. The shaft, they noted, aligned almost directly with the wall where the unknown fingerprint had been found weeks earlier. Still, the logistics didn't add up. The opening was barely wide enough to fit a person, let alone move one without noise or resistance. And there were no fingerprints on the panel, no tool marks, no signs it had been opened recently, just the object at the bottom, placed like a breadcrumb. Rachel kept the watch. Investigators gave it to her after processing. She didn't speak much when she held it for the first time, just stared at it for a long while, then placed it into a small wooden box. She didn't cry, She didn't say anything. But something in her shifted. She no longer hoped her mother was alive. She just wanted to understand why this happened, why someone had gone through so much effort to make Carol vanish, and why, after all of it, they'd let the one thing that proved she'd been there slip through. Because now there was no denying it. Carol Finch had been in that shaft, and someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure she was never found. 8 years passed. In Halberd, the name Carol Finch still lingered like unfinished conversation, quiet, unresolved, and heavy. Most people had stopped talking about it out loud, but they still remembered. The library remained open, though the basement level was largely unused. Staff avoided the closed stacks. Volunteers rotated out quickly. And though no official statement had ever confirmed what happened, there was an unspoken understanding. Whatever occurred that night had never truly been explained. Then, in the fall of the 8th year, a renovation crew was brought in to address foundational issues beneath the building. Water damage had spread along the lower eastern wall of the basement, and city engineers wanted the beams inspected before the structure became unsafe. The workers removed a series of rusted metal supports, revealing a concrete section behind one of the shelving units long since cleared of books. As one of the crew struck a chisel, along a soft seam, part of the outer layer crumbled away, revealing a small cavity, barely the size of a shoebox, built directly into the wall. Inside was a wrapped bundle, tightly sealed in waxed canvas. At first glance, it looked like a field notebook, something military or archival. But as the crew handed it off to the site supervisor, the edge of the canvas shifted, revealing a faint name etched into the leather underneath: C. Finch. The site was closed off immediately. Police were called, and the item was transported under sealed evidence chain. At the station, forensic examiners carefully removed the wax coating. Beneath it was a worn, leather-bound journal. The spine was cracked, the pages slightly warped, but otherwise intact. Every page was written in Carol Finch's handwriting. The first line read, "If you found this, I failed to stay hidden." It was dated October 17th, 6 days after her official disappearance. The ink was faint in places and the entries were erratic. But the story it told changed everything investigators thought they knew. According to the journal, Carol had discovered what she believed to be an access route behind the closed stacks, an unused maintenance tunnel that was not listed in any current blueprint. She described following a trail of markings, symbols identical to those she had found in Miles Shaw's books, leading to a concealed panel behind the bookroom wall. Beyond it, she claimed, was a series of interlocking spaces that predated the current structure, rooms without electricity, brick passages with handwritten signs nailed into beams. One read, "Property of SC Archive, 1911." Another simply read, "Return if found." Carol wrote that the tunnel system was much larger than she anticipated and that it was easy to get disoriented. The final pages detailed how she had returned several times over the course of weeks, bringing flashlights, notebooks, and a hand mirror to reflect light into tight corners. But on what would become her final entry, she wrote that something was different. She wrote that a door she had wedged open was now closed, that the markings had changed, that her own notes, left tucked in a crevice, were missing. And then, one sentence stood alone, circled in ink. "Someone else is down here." She never explains who, or how she knew, but the tone of her entries shifted after that point. What had been a tone of discovery turned into one of surveillance, then fear. She stopped referring to the space as the archive and began calling it the interior. Her final full entry simply read, "If I don't get out, this is what I know." The books were never meant to be shelved. Their signals, names aren't real. It's a map, not a record. Tell Rachel I was right. The journal was verified as authentic by 3 forensic handwriting analysts. The ink matched her preferred brand. The leather cover contained trace elements of dust that matched the foundational wall it was found inside. Investigators re-examined the site, but no other artifacts were found. The cavity had been sealed deliberately and from the inside. No entry point existed from the tunnel described in the pages, if it had ever existed in the first place. Public reaction was divided. Some believed it was Carol's final message, a mental break preserved on paper. Others saw it as confirmation that she had uncovered something truly hidden and had been silenced. Law enforcement reopened the case briefly, reviewing all old footage, logs, and statements. But once again, nothing new appeared. No fingerprints on the journal but her own, no matching symbols in town records, and no trace of the hidden interior she described. Rachel was allowed to read the journal in full under supervision. She didn't speak to the press. She didn't contest the case's unresolved status, but those who knew her said she changed. She stopped trying to prove what happened and started focusing on preserving what remained. She asked the library to cordon off the area near the foundation, not for evidence, but for memory. The journal's now stored in a climate-controlled archive. It's labeled under a new designation, CF01. And beneath that, recovered from wall cavity, October 8th, 8 years to the day. There was still no body, no confirmed sighting, no final moment on camera. But the journal had surfaced. The silence had broken. And the words left behind weren't just memory. They were a warning. The journal's pages were warped from age and damp, but each one was intact, numbered in Carol Finch's careful hand. Investigators had scanned and cataloged it, page by page, before Rachel was given access. She read it in silence, seated in the corner of a municipal records room under a fluorescent light that flickered just enough to distract, but not enough to justify fixing. She turned the pages slowly, with the care of someone holding a living thing, because this wasn't just a document. It was her mother's voice, preserved in ink. It didn't tell her what happened, but it told her something almost worse, that Carol had known it was coming. The early entries read like research. Carol wrote about finding inconsistencies in the donation records, names appearing in some inventories and disappearing in others, entire collections with no origin. In one case, a leather-bound book supposedly from the 1920s had a library card inside dated 1906, 2 decades before it was even printed. She started keeping a separate log of these anomalies, cross-referencing them against the known history of Halberd. But the more she compared, the more things stopped lining up. She found letters hidden inside old books, tucked between pages, folded so tightly they seemed like part of the binding. They weren't addressed to anyone directly, but they shared certain patterns. Each one referenced meetings, initials, or discussions about which books should remain unshelved. Some included coordinates or dates that led to nothing, but the handwriting varied, suggesting multiple authors, and all of them used the same phrase repeatedly: "The circle holds." Carol initially thought she'd stumbled on a literary club or early library committee. But the tone of the letters was different. They didn't read like administrative notes or social chatter. They read like orders, decisions being made about information, what to store, what to hide, and what to leave visible but misleading. She began to suspect that the founding members of the library, and possibly the town itself, had created a controlled archive, one where certain facts were curated, others erased, not burned, not buried, but coded into public access so they could never be truly understood unless someone knew how to look. That idea consumed her. In the entries dated just 2 weeks before her disappearance, Carol described receiving anonymous notes in her mailbox at the library. Small envelopes, no return address, each one containing only a phrase or a page torn from a book. One had a quote from a 1947 edition of a Halberd Town yearbook with 2 names circled in red. Another included a list of catalog numbers that didn't match anything in the current system. She took it to a colleague who said it must be a prank, but Carol didn't believe that. She wrote, "Someone is guiding me, or trying to stop me, I don't know which." She mentioned being followed once, after closing on a Tuesday. A figure outside near the newspaper stand. She couldn't describe them. She didn't see a face, just the presence. She started locking her office door from the inside. She wrote that the security footage didn't always match her memory of events, that once an entire 5-minute window had disappeared from the timestamp. When she brought it up to the library director, they claimed it was a system glitch. She wrote that she didn't believe them, The entries grew more fragmented after that. Her handwriting changed, tighter, more rushed. Symbols began appearing in the margins, small, repeating icons, 3 vertical lines crossed by a single slash. Later entries included sketches, floor layouts, diagrams, arrows pointing to blank spaces. One page had a ripped section taped back in with the phrase, "Don't trust what's been recatalogued." She stopped dating her entries. She no longer signed her initials. Rachel paused more than once reading those final pages. There were names mentioned that didn't appear anywhere else in Carol's known records. One line read, "F. Harrow was never real." Another simply said, "The ink is the map." She wrote about symbols appearing in different books like breadcrumbs. And one line, repeated 3 times across different pages, "Not a library. Not a library. Not a library." The final pages were chaotic. Dozens of notes overlapping, sentences that began and didn't finish. A list of books, only half readable. Symbols scrawled so fast they slanted off the paper. There was no final message, no explanation, no farewell. Just a page with a single phrase written in what looked like shaking hands. "I found the circle." It's not a place. Rachel closed the journal and sat in silence for several minutes. The answers were all there, but they weren't. Her mother had uncovered something tied to the books, the founders, the town itself. But whether it was a conspiracy, a shared delusion, or something else entirely, she hadn't lived long enough to name it. And now the words were all that remained, their meaning buried in a code that no one else had yet been able to break. The journal was real. That much no one could deny. The tests had been thorough. The ink was consistent with the type Carol had always used. The fibers matched her notebooks. The pages, though yellowed with time and faintly warped by humidity, contained nothing to suggest they were forged. Forensics swabbed every inch, hoping for DNA, hoping someone else had touched it, left a mark, made a mistake. But there was nothing. No fingerprints, no skin cells, no trace, just Carol's, no more, no less. Handwriting analysts examined the document for weeks. 3 separate specialists reviewed every page. Their conclusion was unanimous. It was her. The curvature, the pressure points, the natural inconsistencies that occur only when writing over time. It all matched. She had written it. Not under duress, not in a rush, but deliberately. Slowly. Thoughtfully. As if she knew this journal might be the only thing left behind. As if she expected someone would find it, not immediately, but eventually. The journal reignited interest in the case. Police reopened the file, temporarily. They re-examined prior witness statements, reviewed the camera footage once again. They pulled blueprints, contacted former staff, and tried to retrace her final days with a new lens. But as before, it led nowhere. The shaft where her watch was found hadn't yielded new evidence. The man in the blue coat was never identified, and the passageways Carol claimed existed within the walls of the library were nowhere to be found. If they had ever been real, they had been sealed or erased. Rachel kept the journal, not hidden but preserved. She had it enclosed in a climate-controlled glass case in the corner of her home office. No dramatic lighting, no display stand. Just the book, resting open to the last page. Untranslated. The symbols on that page had resisted every attempt at decoding. Linguists, cryptographers, and amateur sleuths had taken their turns. Online forums filled with speculation. People drew comparisons to early cipher systems, encryption algorithms, even religious iconography. But none of it fit. None of it made sense. It remained what it had always been, a page of meaning without a key. Rachel read it often, not hoping for a breakthrough, but as a kind of ritual. A way to stay close. She said the handwriting still smelled like old books, still felt like her mother's presence was in the room, not in a supernatural way, just in the physical truth that these pages were the last real living extension of who Carol had been. A record not just of thoughts, but of moments, of decisions, and of fear. The town of Halberd slowly moved on. The library underwent further renovations, The section of wall where the journal had been found was reinforced, resealed, and painted over. No plaque, no acknowledgement. For most, the building was simply a library again. For Rachel, it would never be anything less than a locked archive of questions, some whispered through time, others deliberately silenced. In interviews, Rachel often repeated the same phrase. It wasn't just a disappearance, it was a removal. She believed someone had watched her mother, followed her work, and stepped in when the truth came too close. Not for revenge, not for gain, but for control, for secrecy, for preservation. And yet they had failed to stop the one thing Carol left behind: her words. What made the journal so unsettling wasn't what it revealed, it was what it implied. It hinted at a system of encoded knowledge operating beneath the surface of a quiet town, a system that had outlived its creators, something maintained not by individuals, but by silence itself. And Carol, by deciphering even part of it, had become a liability. Or maybe she became something else, someone chosen. It depended on how you read the entries. Rachel wasn't sure which interpretation scared her more. Years later, the case of Carol Finch remains officially unsolved. Her name still appears on missing persons registries. Her photo is still updated in databases, but no one has come forward. No remains have been found. No new evidence has emerged. The file sits dormant, like so many others, until something, someday, might surface. But in Rachel's home, behind the quiet glass, the journal remains open. Dust no longer clings to the cover. The ink has not faded. The weight of each page is still there. And the final line remains as it always was, undeciphered, untouched, and unwavering. In a town where people once believed everything worth knowing was shelved neatly and recorded, Carol Finch's disappearance left behind something no one could file away. A voice that was never silenced, only encoded. A mystery written down, waiting patiently for someone to understand.